Well, the world is awaiting a decision by the International Court of Justice on whether or not Israel has indeed committed acts of genocide in Gaza. Last week, let's remind you, the International Court of Justice heard South Africa's case accusing Israel of breaching the UN Genocide Convention in the Gaza war during a 3-month conflict that has seen more than 20,000 people killed and scores displaced. South Africa took Israel to the International Court of Justice, accusing it of carrying out a genocide in Gaza. Israel's legal team, on the other hand, said South Africa's claim was baseless and they had failed to make the case. Now, to look at the ICJ's next move, we're joined in studio by the head of diplomacy and foreign policy at the University of Johannesburg, Professor Chris Landsberg, and virtually we're joined by senior lecturer at the Department of Political Science at the University of Pretoria, Dr. Sithembile Mbete. Good to have both of you. Thank you so much for being with us this morning. Prof, thanks for coming in. And Dr. Mbete, good to have you. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much for having us.
Absolute pleasure. I'm really looking forward to this conversation because we obviously left off. We did an analysis on South Africa's arguments and how they put forward. But Doc, let me begin with you and then we'll come to studio. So just very quickly, how do you think Israel did?
Look, I think that Israel's strategy was to avoid the substantive elements of what South Africa had said, and to rather focus on Hamas as a terrorist organization, and that South Africa was basically accusing South Africa as acting as proxy for Hamas, saying South Africa is acting as the legal arm of Hamas. Secondly, they focused on Israel's right to self-defense, and so emphasizing that the actions that were being undertaken, the military operation, was to prevent another 7th of October from taking place, and that ceasing military operations would place Israeli citizens in danger. The third thing that they did is that they focused on what they called Israel's humanitarian actions and interventions in Gaza, basically trying to put paid to the claim that Israel was creating a dire humanitarian situation and listing a number of things that they claimed Israel was doing in order to support the people of Gaza in a humanitarian fashion, including setting up field hospitals, providing incubators and food and water to the people in Gaza. And then the fourth thing that the Israeli legal team did is that they challenged the provisional measures that South Africa is requesting and basically challenge them as having no basis in international law and as actually overreaching and stretching the power of the ICJ into internal or domestic Israeli decision-making and policy-making.
All right. So, I mean, that in a nutshell is very much so how we saw the Israelis coming through, defending themselves and poking holes in South Africa's argument. But, Prof, having a look at both of them side by side now, what were your views? How are you feeling now after looking at what South Africa did and what Israel did? Who's got the stronger case here?
Who's got the stronger case here? I mean, I just want to remind you in the discussion with Sakina what I said. Let's not forget one important thing. Those 15 judges, their jobs are on the line. They are all political appointees. Yeah. And I'm saying that they're going to try as best as they can, and there will be the likes of Belgium, of Brazil and others that will really hone in on the legal merits of the argument. Was genocide proof? And I think they're veering in that direction. But make no mistake, there are judges that's going to take their cue from the capitals.
Yeah.
Look what Germany just this weekend. They literally came out saying, we're going to resist any attempt to find Israel guilty. And then they threw in a very interesting spanner in the works for me. And I would like to know what Dr. Mbete thinks of this. They said the Genocide Convention of 48 was actually confined to the Holocaust. It was not about anything subsequent. It wasn't about Rwanda. It certainly wasn't about this. The battle lines are drawn. But let me answer the key question that you asked, Dr. Mbete, as well. Israel made a political case. Anybody in their right mind to expect Israel to go there to say, if we committed genocide, it was by accident because Hamas used them as shield. Israel wasn't going to go there. Yeah. And let me tell you, even how wary they were of where they would go. They did not mention figures about how many people they killed. The kind of bombs, the carpet bombing. And so, because they know those things verges, if not on genocide, then certainly on crimes against humanity. Let me say this about South Africa finally. I stick to what I said on Friday, that South Africa made a methodical, systematic, well-thought-through case. But I was not surprised that Israel said, you sit there in the southern tip of Africa, you're not on the ground, you don't really know what the facts are. We are the ones that opened the gates for humanitarian aid and intervention, which is not true, by the way, and try to, as you put it, Leanne, poke holes in South Africa's argument, not legally, I put it to you, politically.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's what we very much so did here. And also, I mean, they even put question marks, and this was on the Israeli side, that a lot of what we're hearing are numbers coming from the Palestinians as to the number of people killed, as to this, as to that. So, you know, where are the facts? So they're trying to, you know, show that, you know, is this actually true, the amount of people that are being killed? But, you know, these are all things that I imagine we hope we can sit down and the judges will sit down, even though you bring up the political story. I'd love to, Dr. Mbete, hear your view on the utterances of what Germany had to say about something like this as well, the stance on genocide.
Well, I first want to start with the ICJ judges. And yes, the process of selection and then appointment of the judges is political. However, the judges are still professional lawyers, right, with professional integrity that they need to try to maintain. And one of the things that and one of the biggest strengths, I think, and on the issue of provisional measures, let's remember that at this stage, the court is not required to answer the question of has Israel committed genocide in Gaza. All they need to answer is, are the actions being undertaken by Israel in Gaza plausibly actions that could be thought of as genocidal? It's a far lower burden of proof. And this, many of the judges on this bench, not all of them, were the judges, same people who made the decision in January of 2020 on the Gambia versus Myanmar to implement provisional measures, to indicate provisional measures in that situation to stop the perceived or the possible genocide against the Rohingya people in Myanmar. And what the provisional measures that South Africa has requested, there's about 9 of them. 4 of them are almost verbatim from the provisional measures that were granted to Myanmar. So the quandary that this group of judges is going to face is that their own case law in both the Myanmar case and the Ukraine-Russia case, the Myanmar case is the one I'm focusing on because in that case, Myanmar came in to defend itself, and Russia didn't come to the court to the hearings. In both of those cases, the provisional measures that they put in place were almost identical to the ones that South Africa is requesting. And the argument that they made is that we may not be able to say that there's definitely a genocide taking place, but there's plausible grounds to think so. And so to avoid that eventuality, and let's remember that the Genocide Convention is meant to be preventative. And this is where I think that there's a great deal of disingenuity in the German argument, is that yes, the Genocide Convention was inspired and came out as a result of the Holocaust, but it was to prevent a similar thing ever happening again. If the Genocide Convention was only to prosecute Holocaust crimes, then it would have only needed to exist for 5, 10, 15 years and then would be dissolved. The point about the Genocide Convention was supposed to prevent anything like the Holocaust happening again. And the ICJ learned a very, very horrible lesson in the 1990s, where it failed to prevent the genocide in Bosnia and failed to grant the provisional measures that would have stopped the fighting in Bosnia. And then a genocide happened. Hundreds of thousands of young people died, of men died.
So this is the preventative side. There is a lot of arguments.
The preventative side is really important.
So what I want to find out from you is that and Prof, I know you've got a lot to say as well, but the reality is that the ICJ has no capacity to mandate compliance, other than obviously to go the route of the UN Security Council, which the US government can veto. That's a reality.
I like the way you put it. You said they don't have, and I'm putting words in your mouth, that they don't have enforceability capacity. However, their finding is supposed to be binding. It's member states of the UN that disregards a supreme apex court like the UN, in this case the ICJ. So the problem is not the ICJ and their finding. And if I could just throw out a speculation here, they might say, just for argument's sake, we agree with South Africa that you should really stop the bombing of civilians. However, Israel has a right to continue to go after Hamas. Then we sit with a real mess.
What happens?
But to come to your point, whatever their finding is, and I am struck by their own announcement this weekend that as early as Friday, we were preparing, Sithembile and myself and others, we were preparing for the 7th of February. They say we might have a ruling as early as Friday. So where you have to give them credit is there's an urgency that they're showing. Now, I think South Africa and Israel, by the way, is using the space this week to get as much evidentiary evidence to back their cases from other countries, for South Africa to not only quote ministers and presidents making these purported genocidal statements or real statements, but to go and prove with evidence that it is happening. So in a nutshell, Leanne, I think the UN, unfortunately, the eyes will be in the UN as to whether they will veto an ICJ ruling, whatever that ruling is, on Friday or beyond.
Amazing. But let's look at this. So obviously we're covering in the news that it's 100 days since what had happened.
Today.
Today, right. So over the weekend, Netanyahu comes out and has vowed, this is what he said, I'm quoting from an article in the Financial Times, vowed to continue Israel's war in Gaza until total victory, marking these 100 days of comments. So he spoke at this press conference saying, Israel defiantly brushes aside calls for a ceasefire, blasted South Africa's allegations that Israel is committing genocide and will continue to do this. Nobody will stop us. So let's go, Doctor. What do you think? I mean, it sounds as though it doesn't matter who rules what. Israel are not going to stop in their fight against Hamas, and certainly not try and prevent the loss of lives of innocent Palestinians. What are you thinking of some of these utterances made?
Indeed, and I think that what these utterances do is that they say, because if the Israeli government is saying that they won't abide by any, attempt by the ICJ, any provisional measures that would try to stop the conflict, and that they're just going to continue, they effectively then make themselves a pariah, because they put themselves in the position of being a state that is actively defying the apex court of the UN, and they then also place their supporters, the United States, Germany, Canada, others. And let's not forget that part of Germany's support to Israel comes from the amount of arms that Germany has sold to Israel since the 7th of October. So those countries that have been arming Israel more extensively since the 7th of October are now going to be placed in a very awkward position. if Netanyahu and his government continue to defy or say that they're going to defy whatever comes from the ICJ and continue their military operation in Gaza. Because even though it's being framed as we are going after Hamas and we're not going to stop until Hamas is gone, what they're also saying is that Hamas is embedded within the civilian population of Gaza. So how do you get rid of Hamas if it's embedded in the civilian population? You need to be attacking the civilian population as well. Yeah. And so what it does, I think, is that it risks deep isolation for Israel, not only for Israel, but also for the countries that have come out so strongly in support of Israel, no matter what, no matter its actions.
Yeah.
And so I think that there's a real diplomatic situation that's going to be brewing here between Israel and its supporters.
I'm going to pause the conversation. We need to take our news bulletin, but I am going to come back and we'll just wrap it up, give further ideas in terms of, we've got until Friday, which is quite unbelievable, as you say, as to how fast we're going to act on this and perhaps get a finding and, some of the other ideas accompanied by this. So let's get into our news at 8 o'clock and then we'll come and wrap up this conversation. All right, thanks very much, SK. So let's get back into this conversation and start wrapping things up. So my guests, once again, we're joined here by the head of diplomacy and foreign policy at the University of Johannesburg. That's Professor Chris Landsberg. And we've got senior lecturer at the Department of Political Science of the University of Pretoria, Dr. Sithembile Mbete. So again, thank you so much for staying on, both of you. I mean, such a complex issue. It's very difficult to cover it in a short amount of time. But let's try and get as much as we can to end this. What always got me was obviously there's, Prof, let me come to you on this. There are questions that need to be asked by these judges, whether we like it or not. There are a lot of things that have been said in these arguments that were offered. South Africa by Israel have been called stooges of Hamas. They've been called the legal arm of Hamas. What if, and South Africa making a lot of allegations against Israel as well, what happens now in terms of the judges wanting to ask questions? We saw our legal team arriving back in South Africa. Where to from here for this week? Where do we go if judges want questions?
I want to piggyback onto something Dr. Mbete said and say this to you. I give the judges the benefit of the doubt, albeit that I've said they are political appointees, that they would want to be seen to be even-handed doing their job. It's not a political decision. The judge president, who happens to be an American, said, we want some of your legal representatives to hang around The Hague until that preliminary, because we might and are likely to have questions for you. We're going to come back to both of you and ask you some questions so that we know, so that we make the most informed judgment. So that's what's going to happen. In South Africa's case, let me tell you, and I'm saying again what I said to Sakina on Friday, but I'll try and put it differently. For me, the 2 points that I think South Africa didn't drive home enough is, one, yes, there was the 7th of October, and we knew that Israel justifiably was going to hammer on that, and I'm going to use the word, people think we bias, act of terror by Hamas. Well, I was surprised that South Africa didn't go to what happened prior to the 6th of October, 2018, 2015, the 1967 war, where this whole thing started in 1917, when Britain just handed 50% of the land to a people. And here's the point I'm going to make very crudely and politically. You can suppress a people for so long, whether it's in Africa, Latin America, and so on. At some point, don't be surprised if they pick up arms. And I was surprised that South Africa didn't drive that point home. More importantly, South Africa didn't make a convincing case. They were professional. They stuck to the rules of the game. But they didn't make, for me, the link between the statements of the leaders, all these genocidal statements of don't give them water, medicine, everything, and the actual actions. So it's almost like when they say, we're not going to give them water, if you can have evidence that the troops then went to that infrastructure and bomb it, then you make a clear, convincing case that intent led to actions which is genocidal.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So we've got that, and these are the kind of things we may start seeing come out this week, with questions coming through to provide more evidence, because people were asking, where is the evidence? We need more evidence of the accusations that are being made. We got to start wrapping, and very, very quickly. What about Hamas, Dr. Mbete? We cannot ignore what they have done. Going into Israel on the 7th of October, killing people the way that they did. We're putting Israel on trial for the reasons that we've been put through. But what about Hamas? Why have they not been hauled before the ICC, for instance, or any other mechanism? Because what they have done as well is absolutely atrocious.
Indeed, what Hamas did is atrocious. But let's remember that Hamas is not a state. It's not a state's party. So it can't be hauled in front of the ICJ. Certainly, leaders of Hamas can be hauled in front of the ICC for their individual crimes. But South Africa doesn't have to do that to justify why it's also taking Israel to the ICJ. There are other countries that can take Hamas to the ICC, and they should. And if they, so for me, the idea that South Africa should be both pursuing this case against Israel and pursuing Hamas at the ICC in order to be legitimate in its case against Israel is something that you would not ask of any other country. So why are we asking it for South Africa? And certainly there are other countries that can take the case of Hamas to the ICC if they so wish. Yeah. But the second thing that I do want to say, in response to what Prof. Landsberg has said around evidence and also framing this in terms of the long durée of history, I think if you read the South African application, it certainly places all of this in context and refers to the UN's own reports about 2016, about 2005, about 1967. So if you look at the evidence that has been submitted, not just the oral arguments that were made, but the evidence that supported those oral arguments, which you can find in both the application and in the record of proceedings, the evidence is there. It is backed by so much of the UN's own reporting, so much of the UN's own expert testimony. And that's an important thing, because let's not forget the ICJ is a UN institution. It's an organ of the UN. And what South Africa has done is it has used extensive UN reporting in order to justify its allegations. And I think that is critical, because if the ICJ says, well, we don't trust your evidence, then it's effectively saying that we don't trust the evidence that is being provided by UN institutions, UN experts, UN leadership. Yeah. And that is a quandary, I think, that they don't want to get into.
I have so many more questions. I really do. The impact that this has had on South Africa's reputation with the Western world and the US by bringing this forward. What will happen to Palestine if, for instance, the bombs do stop overnight? We've seen what the country looks like. What would happen? I don't have time.
I just hope you and Sakina are thoroughly confused by now.
Thank you. We are. We're confused. I hope South Africa isn't too confused. But listen, it's a big week, and we thank you for giving us your analysis. But I know we'll have you back when we get something out of the ICJ. And as you heard, it could be as early as the end of this week, could be Friday, that we do hear something. But it's a very busy week up until then. Hope we've helped you understand a little bit more what came out of last week, and of course what to expect this week going forward. Head of Diplomacy and Foreign Policy at the University of Johannesburg, Prof. Chris Landsberg, and of course Senior Lecturer at the Department of Political Science at the University of Pretoria, Dr. Sithembile Mbete.